Thanks so much, Tero, and thanks to everyone at the Animal Law Center for hosting me. It's a pleasure to be here in the seminar. It's my first time actually, so I'm really excited to be here. So in my presentation, I will be talking to you and then hopefully in the discussion with you about how we can rethink democracy in a way that accommodates the interests not only of humans but of all sentient beings. Now, as we discussed before the seminar started, there's a range of different presentations out there, from ideas that a speaker had in the shower to something really polished where they're just presenting, a paper that's already been published. This presentation here is very much on the shower end of the spectrum, as it were. But on the bright side, this really means that I will be able to, take on board your criticisms, your comments. So I really look forward to the discussion. Now, what I propose to start with here is a painting that I'm sure you're familiar with. It's Banksy. And this is often read as ridiculing MPs, and I propose to give it a more positive spin. I think it invites us to rethink, democracy, politics. What would it mean for politics not just to be done, for by humans for humans, but maybe, potentially including animals in some form or another, and certainly be done in the interest of animals too, and not just humans. So maybe we can take this as a bit of a sort of a guiding image. Now, what I will do in my presentation is to start by giving you a bit of background on this paper that I'm presenting, which is in fact a chapter in a forthcoming book. I will then make the case for including sentient animals in democracy and explain exactly how I and a co-author, in fact, are trying to make this argument. We will then look in some detail at a debate that is fairly prominent in scholarship on animal democracy, animal politics, and that's the debate as to whether animals have political agency or are just political patients. And I'll propose to overcome that debate. I will then argue that when it comes to sentient-based democracy, we need both a legal and a political approach to really give due concern to sentient beings. And then lastly, I will propose that we should also transcend merely looking at representative, indirect democratic processes, but also potentially take into account and propose some direct democratic instruments for sentient-based democracy. And I'll retrace the main ideas of the presentation in the conclusion. Okay, so that's our roadmap. Starting with some background. As alluded to, this is a chapter in a book that I'm writing with John Adenitire. The book is called Animals and the Constitution: Towards Sentient-Based Democracy. What this book does, or at this stage proposes to do, is to challenge the human-centered understandings of constitutions, both in constitutional theory and also constitutional practice, where constitutions really revolve around humans and their interests. And what we do is we challenge this and we propose a more capacious account of constitutionalism that takes into account the interests of not just humans, but all sentient beings. And what the book also does is, after making the case for sentience-based constitutionalism, it shows what this would mean in practice. So we look at 5 key principles of the constitutional state, and we reimagine them, rethink them in a sentient-based way. And these principles are the rule of law, proportionality, constitutional rights, sovereignty, and last but not least, democracy. And so obviously this presentation today is about the democracy chapter. This chapter is part of a political turn in animal studies more broadly, but also in animal law. And some of you may be familiar with this notion. Essentially, in the last 1 or 2 decades, we are seeing a shift away from merely thinking about individual ethics and what individuals owe to other animals. Should you become vegan, yes or no? To the to more systemic considerations of the political system, the institutions, the processes that shape our interactions with animals in a perhaps more fundamental way. So there's more attention being given to that, and some of the well-known scholars promoting this or pushing this political turn are Robert Garner, Alistair Cochrane, Siobhan O'Sullivan, and many others, and we'll see and discuss some more in the next few minutes. In a nutshell, the argument for sentience-based constitutionalism is as follows, or really this is what it conveys. It's about arguing that those who exercise public powers should give due concern to the interests of all sentient beings whom they govern. So let me briefly walk through these steps to just put a bit more flesh on the bones here. So we look at constitutionally sanctioned powers, right? So public officials of one or another sort of type. These, we argue, should give due concern, by which we mean respect the inherent value and the fundamental interests of the given creatures. We look at interests, so broadly this is an interest-based approach that we are pursuing. We focus on sentient beings. We define sentience roughly as the capacity to feel, and just maybe to anticipate a potential challenge here, we argue that sentience is a sufficient condition for having constitutional worth, as we call it. It's not a necessary condition. So if you are more of a sort of vulnerability person, or you prefer the relational approach, be my guest, that's fine by us. It's just we focus on sentience, and we take it as sufficient condition. And then lastly, we think that this duty applies with regard to animals that are governed by these public powers. So by this, we essentially mean something narrower than what's known in the literature as the all affected interest principle. So this is Robert Goodin arguing that if you're affected by a decision, then effectively you have a stake in it and should have a say in it. We believe this is too broad, because it could give animals in sort of remote countries potentially a say in democratic decisions in a given country. We think that's too broad. But we also distance ourselves from more narrow accounts, such as Robert Garner's, who focuses on who is being coerced by a decision, focusing very much on autonomy, which we think is too narrow. So we essentially just say whoever is governed by a decision, and sentient beings are governed by constitutional decisions. Laws apply to sentient beings. Therefore, those exercising public power should give due concern to them. Okay, this in a nutshell is what we call the all governed interests principle. Okay, so this was just by way of some background, so you can place the chapter. Let me now try to make the case for including sentient animals in democracy. And the case very much builds on what I just outlined with regard to sentient-based constitutionalism. The argument that we're making is effectively the same. So just to recall here, the anthropocentrism that is governing current democratic arrangements, right? So just as we have anthropocentrism governing constitutionalism more broadly, it is also governing democracies. There isn't a democracy in the world that considers animals, as non-human animals, as part of the demos. there is no democracy in the world that has reserved seats for animal representatives. You know, one person, one vote means one human person, one vote. It doesn't mean non-human persons, right? So this is very much the status quo that we are facing. Now, the argument that we put forward in the chapter, which in fact is going to be quite a short one because it draws on what I presented on the previous slide, is effectively that democratic processes, and this is going to be very familiar to you now, should give due concern to the interests of all sentient beings whom they govern, right? Animals are governed by democratic bodies through democratic decisions. They have morally relevant interests. You know, they are sentient creatures, so they should be given due concern, by which we mean their inherent worth should be respected and their fundamental interests should be respected because, you know, they tick all these boxes. In other words, you could say animals should be seen as part of the demos in the relevant sense. Now, I'm sort of skating through this fairly swiftly because this isn't particularly original. Others before have made similar arguments. So just to give two examples here, Alistair Cochrane has argued in his Sentientist Politics from 2018 and Should Animals Have Political Rights from 2020 that sentient animals should have a right to democratic representation, right? So they have a right to democratic membership is what he's arguing. Similarly, Janneke Vink in her book from 2020, The Open Society and Its Animals, argues that animals have a consideration right, by which she means roughly that rulers should give consideration to their interests in their decisions. And we'll see in a few minutes how she fleshes that out. So these authors make arguments in a similar vein. So I'm just going to move on now, but we can come back to the normative case in the discussion if you're interested in this. So what I'd like to now focus on with you is this debate that has been really quite prominent about whether we should view non-human animals as having political agency or not. And obviously this really matters in the context of democracy because we tend to think that you need to have political agency to elect representatives, to maybe serve as a representative yourself. So it really matters whether animals are seen as political agents, one might think at least. And there are broadly two strands in this debate. So there are the folks who broadly argue that animals are political patients. They are not political agents. So in other words, animals require assistance by human representatives in order for their interests to be actually translated into the political process, into democracy. So from top to bottom here, some of you may recognize these beautiful faces. We have Janneke Vink, we have Alistair Cochrane, and we have Angie Pepper. They are some of the main proponents of this view that is skeptical of animal political agency. But in recent times, there is another strand of the debate that has become more prominent, I would say. So folks who argue that in fact, if you look closely, animals are political agents. They're not political patients. Again, from top to bottom, we have Sue Donaldson, Will Kymlicka, Eva Meyer, and Charlotte Blattner. They take the opposite view of what we can call maybe the political patients group. Now, maybe just to make it a bit more concrete, we can maybe look at Vink and Donaldson, who had an exchange that I would recommend to you if you're interested in this stuff. It's a really helpful exchange. It was published in the journal Democratic Theory in 2021. It's called Realizing Interspecies Democracy, Sue Donaldson, Yannick Evink, and Jean-Paul Gagnon, who exchange views and sort of make this debate, I think, quite lively and easy sort of to follow their positions. And so Vink, what she does is she defines political agency as follows. She says political agency means that you need to be able to intentionally aim to affect political institutions, right? Intentionally aim to affect political institutions. So it takes a degree of intelligence and rationality. And she argues that animals just don't have that. Think of a dog. She says, if a dog chooses to, walk down one path rather than the other, they're exercising agency, yes, but not political agency. Only humans are able to do that, is roughly what Vink and other in the political patients group are arguing. But let's now contrast this with the political agents group, again, using Donaldson here. So she defines political agency much more broadly. For her, it is not limited to, I quote, participation in social movements or institutional political processes, but refers to a variety of individual and collective, official and mundane ways of acting, affecting, and impacting politically, right? So it's a very broad definition. And what Donaldson and others do is they view agency as dependent agency, right? So the idea here is that we all depend on others to act and to be agents. And adult human beings are no different in that respect from non-human animals or human infants for that matter, or people with mental disabilities. We all need the support of others to develop our capacities, and also we require uptake. Others need to respond to what we're doing, and if we're just being ignored, then you can be the most rational person in the world, and you're not really going to be able to act as an agent, is the idea here. And where this uptake isn't provided, Eva Meyer, for instance, argues that there is epistemic and institutional violence that is committed, right? We're not, say, listening to animals. We're not receptive to what they're saying, to their agency. And it's not that they don't have it, it's that we don't listen to it, is the idea. Now, as interesting as this debate is, what I'd like to propose to you now is that, at least for my purposes in the chapter, it's a red herring. What I mean by this is that it seems to me that to a significant extent, these people are talking past one another. If you look closely at what the political patients group, so the Vinks, the Cochrans, the Peppers are saying, they emphasize formal political processes. They talk about, who can sit in parliament, who can elect MPs. That is what they are primarily concerned with. Whereas the political agents group, the Donaldsons, the Myers, the Blattners, they focus a lot on informal political processes, right? So just to give an example, Donaldson and Kimlicka, for instance, talk a lot about animals in public settings, right? So imagine a dog in a restaurant, for instance, where maybe they're not allowed, but they still walk into the restaurant. What does that do? That can be viewed as a political act that can restructure the way, maybe we should allow dogs in here. Everyone really loved the dog walking into the restaurant, right? We should view these interactions as or at least potentially political interactions involving political agency on the part of animals. But these examples very often, if not always, are about informal, you might say, a sort of context. They're not saying that the dog would be sitting in parliament or would be electing an MP. That's not what they're saying, right? And I think that's quite an important thing to note about this debate. Equally, I think both sides of the debate are sometimes taking their points a bit too far. So thinking of Sue Donaldson, for instance, she talks about, this is in the context of disabled people. She says how, there are barriers to political participation, and this is a quote, barriers to political participation that aren't located in the capacities of individuals. In fact, she suggests that all barriers aren't located in the individual capacities, but in the social, attitudinal, architectural, medical, economic, and political environment, right? So she takes a sort of social understanding of disability here and extends it to animals too, and presumably she would to infants and other beings too. But as important as I think the social conception of disability is, surely there is more going on, right? So if you're thinking of infants, for instance, or non-human animals, surely the only thing that's preventing them from participating in formal political processes isn't just the architectural environment and the social environment and the economic environment. It seems to me quite reasonable to say that capacities may be involved too. I think human babies are the obvious example here. But equally, I think the political patients group is sometimes maybe exaggerating their views, and Janneke Vink might be an example here. As much as I like her book, she says that animals' agency is quote unquote irrelevant for questions of democratic representation. But that's a very strong statement. And personally, I think there's no harm in viewing what a dog does in a restaurant as potentially political act, without necessarily having to say it is entirely irrelevant for questions of political representation. Surely, if we have representatives for animals, they would need to take into account how animals interact in sort of shared human-animal spheres. So just to rule it out as being irrelevant strikes me as going a bit too far. But essentially what I'm trying to convey here is that I think we need a synthesis. We can adopt the political agents group's argument of viewing animals as having not just agency, but political agency, whilst still accepting that when it comes to formal political processes, these animals are going to need human assistance. And I don't think this is something that's sort of, again, it's incredibly original. If we look at the more moderate proponents of these different views, Eva Meyer and Alistair Cochrane, for instance, to me, they already seem to be sort of verging toward a middle ground. So Meyer, for instance, said it is important to move from thinking about other animals to thinking and working with them. And she very much accepts that we need to work through existing processes to do that. And Cochrane, for instance, says that representatives need to be trained in the art of good listening. This is achieved by being non-judgmental and striving for empathy, by paying attention to the verbal and non-verbal cues, etc. So it seems to me what he's saying here is that, yes, animal representatives will need to be very much attuned to what the animals are communicating to them. And it seems to me there's no harm in viewing what these animals are doing as, politically relevant, as exercising some form of political agency, because the point is still going to remain that we need humans to assist them in formal democratic processes. So this is how I propose we can, reach a synthesis here. The next point I would like to make is that we shouldn't just be looking at political approaches, but also take into account the legal sphere. Now, why am I saying this? My starting point here is Janneke Vink, again, who in her book argues that political representation for animals effectively isn't going to work, and we need a legal approach instead. And she thinks a legal approach is sufficient to protect what she calls the consideration right, which we encountered before. Now, just in a nutshell, she goes through a whole host of different ways of bringing in animals through political representation, and she finds all of these ways wanting. I can't really, give you sort of all her arguments here, but in a nutshell, she keeps coming back to this point that political representation was developed in the human context, where you have humans with political agency, as she understands it, who elect people, and when they're no longer happy with what their representatives are doing, they won't elect them anymore the next time, right? So you have political accountability at work. And Vink explores ways of replicating that for animals, and she finds it very difficult because it either gives people too much power where they shouldn't have it. It risks being abused by people. It is very difficult to determine who should be the relevant representatives. And she just finds all these different ways sort of unsatisfactory. And she says that actually a legal approach is sufficient. Let's just either have state objectives in constitutions that tell states you need to be, giving animals, their due, or preferably, but maybe not quite possible yet, she says, give them fundamental legal rights. And these will sort of act as side constraints that do the trick, that do all the work that would have been achieved through political representation. Now, my view on this is that Vink here exaggerates the shortcomings of the political approach, but she also underestimates the weaknesses of the legal approach. If you look at sort of her arguments against political representation for animals, it seems she's always assuming the worst possible scenarios, which admittedly may happen, but also might not happen. And there are political checks in place and broader checks, such as the media in place, NGOs in place too, that might actually prevent some of those abuses, or at least make them much less likely. Also, I think she puts quite a lot of faith in the judiciary, and she seems to suggest that they're essentially people who can think objectively and who can take objective judgments. And while she acknowledges the potential for some bias, I don't think she really takes it seriously enough. And what I would like to suggest is that the legal approach, whatever we make of Vink's own arguments, is not going to be sufficient. The first problem is that not all policies and laws that are made necessarily affect rights, right? Or state objectives for that matter. So even if you can bring in the courts at some point to enforce animals' legal rights, this is still going to leave a domain of decisions where those rights are just not going to have anything to contribute to, and where you are missing out if you're not also pursuing a political representation approach for animals. And even where rights are affected, rights are indeterminate to quite some degree, right? If it says, a right to life, well, what does that mean? How high should the penalties be for people who kill animals? Should it just be a penalty? Should they go to prison? Should there be rehabilitative measures for them? What about euthanasia? There's so many questions that some of them the courts may be willing to answer, but others that they're going to say this is just a policy matter for the democratic sort of lawmaker to decide. And if you're just pursuing a legal approach, you're gonna miss out on shaping those decisions, those policies, those laws. Also, there's the issue of not having constitutional review in quite a lot of countries, or where you have constitutional review of having ouster clauses or other sort of domains that are sort of put out of the control of the judiciary. Again, this would make it difficult for a purely legal approach to really show sort of a consideration right, or respect the consideration right for animals. And then also a last point is the following. So political scientists tend to put a lot of weight on the benefits that including a diverse range of viewpoints in the lawmaking process can have from a deliberative point of view, right? So the idea we sort of deliberate, we bring in interest, we look at them, we assess them. Does it make sense? We learn in the process of considering. You're missing out on all of this if you're just pursuing a legal approach and if you're not feeding animal interest into the lawmaking process as such, the political lawmaking process as such. Now, I was fortunate enough to read a draft of Svenja Alhaus's chapter that's forthcoming in the Oxford Handbook of Global Animal Law. And it seems to me she's making a really plausible argument there. She's effectively saying that, you can have a range of different instruments and options. You're not forced to just go for one and ignore all the others. To give you some context here, so she's saying that we need political solutions for animals, and she also proposes to rethink political representation. For her and others indeed in the literature, political representation isn't about a sort of a person directing their representative to do something or another. She proposes we should understand it more as a claim to be speaking for someone else. And there are different people, different bodies that make claims to be speaking on someone else's behalf. And we can assess those claims. Are they true? Are they legitimate? Are they serious? Do they actually promote the interests of the relevant beings whose interests they say they are promoting? So she proposes to look at it in this slightly different way. And what she comes up with is this interplay of different institutions that make claims to representing animals. So she says, on the one hand, we should have something like elected animal trustees. So essentially reserved seats in Parliament where we have people sitting who are going to bring in animals' interests and presumably are going to vote in favor of those interests. And I can say a bit more later if you're interested as to how she proposes to elect them. She also proposes an animal committee. So this, in her conception, would be a committee that is independent. It's outside Parliament, that advises Parliament on which policies to take, that brings in that knowledge, brings in that deliberative aspect too. But then even more broadly, she says there's also NGOs. There are people who are passionate about animal rights and who are, contacting the media to post pieces, who contact the MPs directly, who are bringing in those representative claims in this broader way. And we should see all of this as a dynamic interplay rather than just focusing on one and saying it's problematic and let's move to a legal approach, as Vink seems to be doing. Now, what I would like to suggest here is that Alhaus is very much correct, I think, about the dynamic interplay, but that we need to take it a step further. And we need to take a dynamic approach that's not just political, but one that's legal and political. Just to explain this a bit more, I'm drawing here on Ronald Dworkin's idea and conception of democracy that moves away from what he calls a majoritarian understanding of democracy. So in a sort of essentially a majoritarian understanding of democracy is one where whatever a majority of citizens decide is a democratic decision, right? That's the majoritarian understanding. And he says that that's the intuitive understanding of democracy that most of us have. Dworkin defends constitutional review on the grounds of a broader understanding of democracy, which he calls the constitutional conception of democracy. Here's a quote from his book, Freedom's Law. He says, the constitutional conception involves that collective decisions be made by political institutions whose structure, composition, and practices treat all members of the community as individuals with equal concern and respect, right? So you don't just have the collective decision. This is what the majoritarian understanding focuses on, but you also have the requirement of treating individuals with equal concern and respect. And for instance, where courts, strike down a law by parliament because it doesn't show equal concern and respect to, say, the members of a minority ethnic group, then the court is acting democratically and not undemocratically, right? So this is Dworkin's idea behind this. And I think he's got a point here. He carves out an important role for judges in upholding a notion of democracy that I think is very close to the one that I outlined a few slides ago. And to sort of put it in Dworkinian terms, we might say that democracy is about collective decisions, yes, but decisions taken with due concern to the interests of all governed sentient animals. And this will involve both political and legal institutions. So how can we ensure that due concern is given to animals? Legally, I think it will likely involve something like an entrenched Bill of Rights that grants rights to animals, probably thinking, sort of right to life, bodily and mental integrity, family, potentially, healthcare, habitat, a right to political participation, potentially too, because I think if we are willing to include animals in the political process, then surely they should have a right to be included, right? Based on the argument that I was outlining above, I think this would follow, but I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on this in the discussion. And see how I framed it here as political participation. There's some skepticism about this. Cochrane, for instance, in his book, should animals have political rights, says, oh, this is the Kimlicka Donaldson view, that's going too far. It's viewing animals as citizens that participate themselves politically. Maybe this is one way of looking at it, but I think there's another way of looking at it, which says, yes, animals have interests that matter politically, and these interests ought to be taken into account. And if, as I suggest with this sort of synthetic, as it were, approach or middle ground approach, that animals can be recognized as having political agency, that their assistants or trustees should be taking into account, then why not say that the animals have a right to political participation? And I'll come back to this later on when talking about direct democratic instruments. I think these legal rights would also entail some sort of representation or guardianship, helping the animals to actually bring those rights, enforce those rights in court. But there will also be an interplay here with political processes, is what I'm suggesting. We have, I think, this proposal that makes a lot of sense of having a reserved number of seats for sentient beings, representatives. And I propose to more or less just follow Cochrane's idea here of what he calls a deliberative selection assembly. So the idea is essentially that not every citizen will be able to elect sort of animals representatives, but it's going to be a sort of proxy electorate. So a smaller group of people who will elect those representatives. And to ensure that you don't have a sort of animal representatives just trying to sort of pursue human interests and be voted on those grounds or elected on those grounds, Cochrane proposes that it should be a group of people who are drawn by lot. So there's a lottery of all the citizens, of which some will then be selected for this proxy electorate, where they are going to be provided with sufficient information, where the people running to be animals representatives would sort of, be campaigning, presenting their arguments, and then this proxy electorate would choose the representative. So this is roughly the idea, and I find it pretty interesting, but we can pick it up in the discussion. I also like the idea of a sentient beings committee or an animal committee. This can be extra parliamentary, as Alhaus is arguing and Vink is arguing, but to my mind, it could also be an intra-parliamentary committee. So, this most parliaments of the world, as far as I know, have these kinds of committees that help scrutinize bills, that hold, people to account, MPs to account too. And this could be a pretty helpful way, having a sort of sentient beings committee specifically scrutinizing bills affecting animals, in the same way as you might have a human rights committee scrutinizing human rights bills. And then lastly, there could also be sentient beings initiatives, and I'll pick this point up again now. Because the last theme I'd like to focus on, and I'm conscious of time, Tero, is that we should move beyond focusing on just the representative processes. Maybe this is just, so I'm from Switzerland, and as you may be aware, we have a lot of direct democracy going on. So I'm always struck when I hear people just focusing on indirect democratic processes. Maybe that's just my personal bias, but certainly in the scholarship on animal democracy, animal politics, people are just talking about representative democracy. And I found that a bit sort of confusing and puzzling, because I'm not quite sure whether there's a really good reason for doing that. I think that direct democratic instruments could be a helpful additional tool in that sort of broader toolbox, that integrated dynamic interplay between legal and political instruments. And that's for a few reasons. Direct democratic instruments, in my view, allow direct policy interventions, right? They allow you to either stop a law that is being proposed, hasn't passed yet because there was a referendum, or it allows representatives or citizens more broadly to bring in new ideas and stimulate the policy lawmaking process. And that's something quite valuable, I think, that you don't directly have through just electing, sort of representatives. It also avoids an issue that sort of crops up in the debate around animal representatives, and it's the worry that if you have those people who are elected to represent animals' interests, then what exactly are they allowed to do or not to do with regard to bills that have nothing to do with animals? Should they vote on them? Yes or no? I mean, they're in parliament after all, so presumably they would, but can they do that because they're not actually supposed to be representing the interests of humans? So how does that work? Direct democratic instruments basically avoid this problem because they are about specific policy issues, and they could be tailored in such a way that we have a sort of special protections for animals and their representatives only where animals are actually affected. And then lastly, I think, and this goes back to my point about why don't we include a right to democratic participation for animals, it seems to me that when it comes to such policy proposals, maybe a sort of health insurance for animals, sort of mandatory health insurance, these are probably issues that animals' preferences on could be established more readily, more directly, it seems to me, than with regard to more abstract matters such as, different sort of people running for the office of, being an animal representative, what does their party stand for? These seem slightly more remote as far as, what animals in the immediate preferences on might be. But that's just a thought that I had. And again, I'd be interested in hearing what you think. So just to wrap up, there's two proposals that, we could discuss. I'm drawing here on the terminology developed by Daniel Merkley, a sort of direct democracy scholar. And the idea here is to model initiatives after citizen-initiated referendums. And there are two types, really. There are rejective referendums and more proactive referendums. So if we start with the rejective ones, so these are referendums that are created in response to a law that is being put forward or a constitutional amendment. And it is essentially, it allows citizens to stop that law from being enacted if they can collect enough signatures. And usually then there's a vote among the whole citizenry. Why couldn't we, imagine a deliberative, animal assembly, sort of animal representative assembly, being able to trigger a binding vote when a law is being put forward that threatens to undermine the rights of animals. This vote could, just be one for all citizens to vote. It could even be a veto power potentially if you want to go that far. But this would be an interesting option in my view. Equally, there are proactive referenda where citizens can actually propose measures themselves. So they're not just proposing to an amendment or a law that's being put forward, but they are themselves saying, here's an idea, what do you think? And we could, sort of envisage lower hurdles as far as what it would take to propose such a referendum if it was put forward by animals representatives, such as in an assembly of, the way that Cochrane imagines it. And again, so they could propose ideas for improving animals' rights in a simpler way, more easily than how citizens' initiatives of this sort normally work. But again, these are just some inchoate ideas, and I'll be keen to hear your thoughts on. So just to conclude then, I hope to have shown that if we want to move in the direction of a sentience-based constitution, then looking at the interests of animals in democratic decisions and how they're being affected by them is part of it. And we have to think hard and, more about what it would involve for animals to be, to have their interests represented in those democratic processes. I've also argued that the political agency and patency debate is a bit of a red herring insofar as you can, very much see animals as political agents, while still, I think realizing that human assistance are going to be necessary when it comes to formal democratic processes. I've also argued that we should adopt a dynamic, integrated approach that isn't just pursuing a political or a legal approach, but one that combines the two. And I believe that we would also be looking at not just indirect, but also direct democratic instruments if we are really serious about, giving due concern to sentient beings' interests. But I think above all, what this has shown is that much more work is needed as far as fleshing out all of these different, institutions and the arguments for those institutions. So this was really just meant to be a sketch, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on it. Here's my email address if you have any questions or concerns that you don't want to share in the discussion or that come to you later. But yeah, thanks for your attention, and I look forward to chatting about this now.